Okay, so let me just start. Thank you everyone for joining. I am Daniela Savan, an assistant professor at Stanford GSB. So this is the first meeting of the Marketplace Algorithms and Design Seminar. You will soon see the link to the seminar on the chat. And we have 4 more upcoming talks: Navdeep Sagni, Ramesh Johari, Sarah Ninardi, Peng Shi. If you're interested in the seminar, just feel free to reach out to any of the organizers. So the first speaker for today will be Dr. Preston McAfee. Preston is a Google Distinguished Scientist and a former Chief Economist of Microsoft. He has a PhD from Purdue and was a professor of economics at University of Western Ontario, University of Texas, and at Caltech, where he was also executive officer. He has worked extensively in many topics, including pricing, auctions, antitrust, business strategy, market design, computational advertising, and machine learning. And he's the author of 130 refereed articles, 11 issued patents, and 3 books. We also have 3 guests joining us today, experts in market design. We have Nicole Immorlica from Microsoft Research, Ramesh Johari from Stanford University, Vincent Conitzer from Duke University. And I want to say that during the session, if you want to ask anything, you are of course invited to ask questions. You can either do so by typing in the chat or by raising your hands, and we will unmute you. If there are just too many questions, we will just ask everyone to enter the questions in the chat and we will read as many as we can. So now let me thank Preston, Nicole, Ramesh, and Vince, and let me open it up for questions.
Thank you, Daniela. Preston, I'm delighted to talk to you. I guess in preparation for asking these questions, we all read a couple of thought pieces that Preston wrote, which I found very inspiring. One of them was an interview with the Federal Reserve of Richmond.
Federal Reserve Bank.
Yeah, okay. The Federal Reserve Bank. And so in this interview, you talk initially about what is market design, which I think might be a good thing for us to start off with. And you gave a very interesting definition, which is it's a set of techniques for improving the functioning of markets. And then you listed a wide array of fields that incorporate market design. And certainly you've done a lot of work in the design of particular markets. One sort of question I had is like, how broad is the scope of market design? So I find that throughout my career, I've started to realize you could call almost anything a market. And this gets me into a little bit of trouble because, you know, you need to kind of set some boundaries in order to carve out your work. So you say, what is market design? But I guess my question is, what is a market?
So that's a great question. And it's one with a very long, almost not quite a century of history within economics. Going back to Coase, on the nature of the firm. And Coase's idea was there are really 2 solutions to economic allocation problems. One is markets, the other are firms. And that firms arise when markets don't work very well. That was the Coase view. Unfortunately, that doesn't really help address the question you've asked, because we use market design techniques within firms. So even in places that are kind of clearly not markets. So I guess my answer to the broad question is markets involve multiple traders acting somewhat independently. That's what makes it a market. If there's a command and control structure, then it's a firm and not a market. And really those are the 2 possibilities for economic interactions. We actually use market. I don't actually think there are probably any limits on economic interactions for market design techniques. But let me say, if markets work really well, the market design techniques aren't actually needed. And then there are other places where we haven't figured out how to help. And so, but for example, Al Roth has this sequence of using market design in without prices, without money. So things like kidney exchange. And there are techniques even there where market design can be helpful. And so, let me give the parallel to what is engineering. And really, anytime, you make anything, you could actually have engineering help. And so I think market design is the economics parallel. And I should stop there because otherwise we'll spend the whole hour on this one question.
So Preston, well, actually, let me first ask if Nicole has any follow-ups, but then the thing I wanted to ask you about is directly related to what you just said. So I'll go right after Nicole once she's had a chance to follow up.
Yeah, no, let's make this a conversation. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I find this whole thing about markets and firms really interesting. It does feel like kind of Kosa's old paper is something that has been forgotten in 2020 market design. I thought your comments on the origins of the firm, and in particular, what problem is the firm trying to solve, which is like essentially a coordination failure. That's an important point because a lot of the narrative in the gig economy is around the idea that it's basically presumed that any platform that employs workers as contract labor on the supply side will not want them to be employees. And so, there's AB5 is a bill passed in California specifically that was meant to mandate that some of these firms should be making these workers employees, or at least making steps towards making them equivalent employees. I guess I'm wondering, since we've all started to take for granted that all platforms would prefer workers to be contract labor, do you envision that for certain platforms or in certain industries, it actually makes more sense for them to treat the supply side as employees, essentially convert one side of the market much more into a firm structure? I don't really think we've had enough of that discussion because we've all just presumed that two-sided platforms with the supply side being contract labor is just the way of things. So I'm kind of curious to get your take on that.
So first, it's a great question, and I have two broad points to make. One is all of our thinking about this has been affected by the legal structure. So in the United States, your employment determines your healthcare benefits. That's an enormous, for the average worker, this is an enormous either benefit or lack of benefit. But there was no reason really that healthcare had to be tied to employment. That was a decision made in the Nixon administration, and it will, until we change that, it will continue to distort decisions. And let me give a couple of examples here. So I had a woman who worked for me at the University of Texas as an administrative assistant. She worked half-time because her husband was self-employed and they had no way of getting health benefits otherwise. She didn't want the money so much as the health benefits, but she needed a way of getting health benefits with a pre-existing condition issue. So had we not tied benefits to employment, you would have a very different story on, it's very costly for you to be an independent contractor because you have to deal with all these benefits that you are now in a terrible pool about. So that's one issue, there's this illegal structure. On the other side, though, that it's not only about the legal structure, and let me point to a paper that is one of my favorite papers, is The Firm as an Incentive System by Paul Milgram and Bengt Holmstrom. And what this paper roughly says is that when we look at, we see a correlation of incentives. We see people with who have, let me give the example of truck drivers. So we see truck drivers who work for companies. They're told what route to take. They're told when to maintain the truck. They're told where they're supposed to be at each moment in time. They have almost no control over their decisions, over the decisions. Moreover, they take zero risk. That is, they don't own the truck. The company owns the truck, and they are they have very weak incentives to perform, and are just told what to do. Meanwhile, we have independent truck drivers who own their own vehicle. They get to decide what routes they take, what jobs they take. They're allowed to carry extra stuff in the truck when if they're going somewhere, they can bring they can bring somebody else's stuff in the truck and so on. They have lots of control. And what this paper essentially says is the employment relationship. If I increase your incentive to do any one activity, you're going to tend to weaken your investment in other activities because you're now being pushed into this one activity. In order to get you to continue to do those other activities, I have to increase the incentives on those activities. So you get incentives wind up being complements to each other. If I make one stronger, I need to make a bunch of other ones stronger. Now, flip this on its head. Suppose there's something that I care a lot about, but I can't measure very well. So there's an activity that's important to me as to the customer, but it's hard to measure and it's hard to monitor. As a result, if I put strong incentives on the stuff I can monitor, I'm not going to get very much investment in this thing that I care about that I can't monitor. That's a situation in which I want to use low-powered incentives across the board. So we've run into this, by the way, with school teachers. We would like school teachers to educate students, but what we can measure is how well did the students do on standardized tests. If we put incentives on the teachers for the students to do well on the standardized tests, a lot of other stuff that we care about goes away. As a result, it might be better to lower the incentives across the board. Now, you still have to get some measurement of the stuff that you care about. It's just that could be sporadic and at high variance. So this gives a whole theory of when you're going to get employees. You're going to get employees when there are things that are hard to monitor that you care a lot about. And then you're going to get independent contractors when you can pretty much monitor all the things that matter. And now we've got this wonderful theory about when you're going to be inside the firm and when you're going to be outside. But let me go now, just complete the answer by saying, when you look at something like Uber, really, we can monitor almost everything we care about. We can monitor whether the driver is safe, are they speeding? We can monitor whether what their behavior looks like. But from a social perspective, if we don't make those people employees, they don't get health care. And so until we can solve the healthcare problem, and there are other benefits too, but healthcare is clearly the biggest one, until we can, and by the way, this puts the US at a massive competitive disadvantage that our workers don't have healthcare, that our independent contractors don't have healthcare, because it distorts these market decisions from what they could be otherwise. But I think that's the thing all right, so let me just stop there and see if that was helpful.
Great, maybe just to follow up on that, I just want, because I think one thing I didn't hear in your answer is, let's say we changed, I mean, this is a tremendously optimistic thing to hope for, but let's imagine the US changed so that healthcare was not tied to employment or benefits were not tied to employment. Would you envision then that the trend towards independent contracting and these two-sided markets where one side is contract labor, that would actually accelerate and we would see fewer large firms? So I think I'm wondering, because one thing I didn't hear you really talk as much about is, even if we take that off the table, the benefits issue off the table, it seems to me there are still large coordination failures that are the same as we used to have 50 years ago that led to the creation of a firm. And I don't know that, I guess I don't believe those are going to be gone, even if we eliminated this question of benefits being tied to employment. So it seems like firms will still, large firms will still be the best way to run certain industries, even in that environment.
So that's a really great, there's a really great set of questions associated with this. It's not just even one question. One thing that IT has allowed us to do is to decentralize, and there's been a continuing tension between centralization, which solves some kinds of problems, and decentralization, which solves other problems. Typically, you get better incentives with decentralization and better coordination with centralization. But IT has allowed us to decentralize things that were otherwise centralized. And let me give the example of Sears. So Sears starts life as a mail order company. So Sears, in some sense, looks like a Amazon, right, at its origin. Yes, it used it didn't use the web, it used a catalog, but nonetheless, same idea. it launches stores, I think in the 1940s, but in the 1950s is where really when the physical stores take off. And for the rest of time, it struggles with, should it be centralized or decentralized? As a catalog company, it was just purely centralized. The problem with stores was really epitomized by the fact that they literally had snowblowers for sale in their Puerto Rican stores. You could walk, or in Miami too. You could walk into a Sears in Miami and come out with a snowblower. And I'm sure they sold zero. But here, this is centralization making mistakes. What IT has allowed us to do is actually decentralize better. That is, the machines could handle some of the things that, so centralization kind of forced a certain level of simplification. Now, at the same time that I say that, we've actually not, we have this sense somehow that large firms have gotten larger, but that's not actually true. As the economy has gotten, yes, the large firms got larger, but as a percentage of the economy, they didn't. So if you look at, say, what's the share of GDP of the Fortune 500, it's roughly constant. It is not something that's been growing over time, nor has it been, dramatically shrinking. So one of the things that I think there's a continuing ability of using technology, and this includes, Uber-style market technology, to decentralize, which has lots of advantages. It gives high-powered incentives to people to perform. They get to keep a bigger share of their of what they take. They can react to local conditions. So let me give the example of Walmart. Walmart has 7 regions, and within a region, basically the stores are identical. Across regions, they get to be different with some, Walmart very much though gets this buying power. It gets advantages of centralization. It uses technology to get some of the advantages of decentralization, but not that, not as much as you could envision. I think so the trend is going to be more decentralization. At the same time, there are these coordination advantages, and it's a kind of interesting thing. Can a company like Uber solve the advantages of centralization? That is, so one of the challenges Uber has is, are the cars in the place where they should be, as opposed to the place that will make the driver the most money? And it's a really complicated allocation problem, because if a car has gone from point A to point B, now where it should be has to be a function of the fact that it's currently at B. And so even if I need people in some other location, this one may not be the car that should go there. Very complicated problem. It's obviously something that technology can help. On the other hand, incentives matter too, right? There's the driver. If the driver doesn't want to go to those places, or for whatever reason, that's part of the efficient solution, is that, driver preferences, if you will. And you also lose, when you centralize, you lose the, you get the snow blowers in San Juan, Puerto Rico. All right, so that's kind of, broadly how I think about those issues.
Oh, that's great. All right, I'll yield the floor and let maybe Vince hasn't had a chance to say anything yet either. So
yeah, I actually wanted to follow up on that. I think that's an interesting idea, that IT allows for more decentralization. I think in a way that's true, especially if we think about where the human work is being done. In another way, though, I think that the algorithmic work ends up being much more centralized and ends up taking over a lot more, right? So if we look at that example of the snowblowers, maybe in the end, it's the algorithm deciding that, hey, snowblowers don't seem to sell in Miami. Let's not send any more snowblowers there. And the local employees maybe have many fewer decisions to make at all. So is that kind of a counterpoint to that? And how do we think about the amount of work that's being taken over by algorithms, and that actually centralizing perhaps? And that also ties into the question of, should we expect many jobs to be taken over by AI, or at least be reimagined so that they're not necessary anymore, and they're in that way maybe taken over by IT?
So I guess the way I would frame this is, you could have a Sears, which is a centrally run company, and until fairly recently, it's going to have to simplify its decision processes in a way that if it was just an independent store in Puerto Rico, it would never be ordering snow blowers. The local manager would know better than to order, know that they were not going to sell them. Now, a central organization can get some of the benefits that would have accrued to decentralized operations through these algorithms that even if they sent a few snow blowers, they learn really quickly to quit. And they might even be smart enough to learn when snow shovels become available, oh, snow blowers didn't sell, probably snow shovels won't as well. And so that allows you to get some of the benefits of centralization, things like standardization, buying power, and the like, in the more, and yet still respond to local conditions. So I think that's the sense in which IT favors centralization, because it allows some mimicking of the decentralized outcomes. And the more that goes by, the more mimicking it achieves. And now I managed to forget what your question was.
It was a little bit of a winding question, but that was part of it. And then the other part is, how concerned should we be about AI taking over jobs, right? As an AI researcher, I'm very well aware of all the shortcomings that the technology still has. So I certainly don't imagine it taking over all that many jobs as they are practiced today. But then again, many jobs can be reimagined. We're certainly living in a time that we're reimagining a lot of jobs. And so that might still change rather quickly. So how should we think about this also as a society? Should there be more government spending to keep people employed or other things? Just wondering what your reaction is.
So this is a great question. And actually, I'm going to point to, I wrote a review of Kai-Fu Lee's book, AI Superpowers, about China and the US. And I discussed this at some length, and I'm going to just sort of summarize. It's just, anyone who wants to know more about my views on this can look at that review, at that book review. As book reviews go, it's one of the longest. So first, let me just own up front that this could be different. The history of technology primarily has been physical labor saving, not replacing of thinking. And so it could well be different, that replacing human thought displaces jobs in a way that a bulldozer did not. So a bulldozer, approximately speaking, is worth hundreds of people with shovels. So as a technology, a single bulldozer driver could supplant hundreds of people. One of the key factors in thinking about what's going on with this displacement, and my background as an economist shows here, is that economists tend to think there's an unlimited number of wants. Like, I would love to have lots and lots of stuff, and I'm never going to run out of things that I want. The question is, can we afford it? So when I displace with a bulldozer driver, I displace 100 people with shovels. So that's great. I then accumulate more bulldozers, and I can do lots and lots of stuff that I couldn't do before. And so all we wind up is, everybody winds up being employed, and I get lots of bulldozer drivers and fewer shovel drivers. Well, once you think of it from that perspective, that ultimately everyone gets employed, it's just a question of what kind of jobs do they have. Well, with the bulldozer, I get higher skill jobs. A bulldozer requires skill. Like, I can work a shovel, but I can't really drive a bulldozer. And so I wind up getting higher skill jobs. You have to pay people more to acquire skills. So you wind up with more upper middle class or middle class jobs. So now the question, and I'm going to use the economics jargon.
So this is something I don't know if you want interruptions, but this is something I take a little bit of issue with, because you get the bulldozer driver, but you also get all the factory workers that are building the bulldozer. And in the AI analog, you get the machine that maybe like learns what content to recommend. But as you pointed out in that article, you also have a ton of humans behind the scenes that are doing things like filtering, checking mistakes, labeling documents. And these are more low-skilled jobs than the job that these people are replaced. So I might argue that AI actually is going to drive this inequality wedge even deper than it currently
so
is.
you've jumped to the conclusion, but you've also stated something that it's not that I disagree, it's just I don't know. So let me follow the thread a little bit, which is, you've also emphasized something that I probably would have left out, and I'm glad you said, which is there are a bunch of subsidiary jobs that are input jobs. So with the bulldozer, we wind up, the key question here is, does it produce jobs that are complements to skill acquisition or substitutes? Bulldozers require more skills than shovels. So, and moreover, the factory workers probably needed more skills than workers with shovels. So in the end, we wind up with a higher skilled population. We have to pay them more. And so on balance, we get a richer middle class than we would without the bulldozer. This wasn't true, by the way, with all the innovations. If you look at the steam engine, some research at least suggests that the steam powered actually supplanted a lot of things that were artisan. And we had a de-skilling or a reduction of skills. And we actually saw a reduction in the number of people who would be described as middle class back in the early 1800s, early to mid 1800s. And it's not until you get electricity and factories that you wind up, automated factories, that you wind up seeing an increase in the skill level. Now, turning to AI, let me give the example of the calculator. So it used to be, or for that matter, word processing. If you wanted to work in be a cashier in a restaurant, you had to make change. You had to be able to do math. That's a skill. That skill went away, and actually the real wages of people who work as cashiers fell. That's the threat, that AI might actually supplant thinking, right? Is it so the accountant that used to have to actually have a lot of math skills now just uses a automated program. They have a much lower skill level, and the wages of that, or the real wages of that activity fall. That's the threat. We don't know for sure one way or the other. And a lot depends on, does AI become a tool for people to do their job, or does it replace them? I don't know the answer to this. I will give you one example. So it used to be that Westlaw annotated legal cases. So every time a new legal case came out, a bunch of law students wrote annotations to that. And they connected it to past legal cases, and they basically helped lawyers understand how to understand this new case. Today, about 90% of that activity is done by machines. 10%, so basically, the 10% that are left have to be even smarter. The machines do the bulk of it. They connect all the existing cases. They even write the text. And then humans say, okay, this one's probably wrong. This is, this, like, it's made a mistake here. It's fixed some stuff. That 10% probably has to be a little bit smarter. On the other hand, you've actually knocked out 90% of the work. So whether that's going to, on balance, play out like the bulldozer or the calculator is hard to call at this point.
So let me take a question from now. Rakesh has a question. I'm going to ask him to unmute himself.
Sure.
Sure. Preston, how do you reconcile this concern with AI taking away our jobs and the views of Robert Gordon that we don't see any impact of AI in the productivity statistics?
Yeah, well, we lived through this with computers, right? And so the quip is that computers are everywhere except in the productivity statistics back in the 80s. And then what we saw was a unusually high level of productivity growth in the 90s. Whether that's attributed to computers, I think, is not definite, but let me say it's suggestive that what happened was it took a decade of investment before we really started to see the benefits, and then we saw benefits that lasted more than a decade of higher productivity growth. I think AI is nascent. We're kind of learning how to use it. A lot of companies are investing heavily in creating data lakes that they can start to use to train AI. We're seeing a little bit of AI in, that you chat with AI, it still doesn't work all that well. I think we're some distance from actually AI having that kind of impact that it may have. So that's another thing is that I'm old enough that it's clearly not going to have an impact on me. It may even be 20 or 30 years before it really has the kind of impacts that let me say, Kai-Fu Lee predicts, where he's saying, 50% unemployment caused by AI. Andrew Yang, I think, has very much the same model. So I don't think we're at the point yet where AI has really kicked in. We're still at the point where companies are dumping tons of money into AI or into even the predecessors of AI, hoping that they're going to be able to make improvements and replace jobs and make things more efficient. But I don't think that's happened yet.
One thing you mentioned there is data lakes, and you talk a lot about this in your review of the book, which I did not have a chance to read myself, but I think this is maybe a good point to think about. Is AI requires, especially the neural nets that you seem to emphasize a lot in your review, requires a ton of data. And this data is basically harvested from us by places like Facebook, largely without any sort of payment. So in a sense, we're complementing the AI without a direct monetary incentive to do so. And I'm wondering what your views are on both data markets, data collection, and like regulation around data.
So I have, let me say, I'm still thinking a fair bit about this. I'm really interested in GDPR. So the vision of GDPR is the customer owns the data, except where the data is needed to provide the service. So it puts limits on companies and just on what they can do with data without express permission of the customer. And they've really tried to walk the, they've tried to thread the needle that says we don't want to get in and prevent services from being offered. And let me give the example that if Amazon doesn't know my address, there's no mechanism for them to send me packages. So they need to know my address. On the other hand, knowing my address, they don't need to send a bunch of other stuff to me that I didn't ask for. And the GDPR model says Amazon needs to know my address and can record my address in order to send me packages, a service I asked for. And it doesn't even need permission. It doesn't need to ask me permission for it to record my address, because that's obviously required for sending me packages. But it does need my permission if it wants to use my address for other purposes that weren't needed for the service that I signed up for. I think that's an interesting model. The initial reports about GDPR, I'd have said, were quite positive. I'm now hearing, but I'm not claiming to actually understand, at least fully, a lot more negative things about the implementation about GDPR, especially with respect to small and medium businesses. That is, small and medium businesses are saying, wow, complying with GDPR has really, occupied tons of our cycles, made it difficult for us to offer our services. From the European perspective, that would be a train wreck, because they're, after all, trying to replicate the US startup scene. And so that would be a really serious problem with GDPR if it wound up favoring large enterprises against small and medium enterprises. I think conceptually that's an interesting model, and it's one that bears further study. And I'm really glad that someone is doing that experiment. I actually think that California, by the way, has also passed privacy laws. We have other experiments, and I hope I'm going to learn from those. And beyond that, I don't know that well, so let me stop there, because you have asked another question.
Preston, can I ask you something?
Hours on.
Can I ask you something to follow up on this set of threads, and returning kind of to that decentralization theme as well? I mean, one phrase that comes to mind thinking about data lakes and kind of computation centralization for AI is public good. So, one perspective on computers might be that, in part, computers became a platform on which all kinds of other innovation could happen. And it was important that those were platforms that, allowed a lot of open development to take place. AI, I think, my own perception is that the risks are far, far greater, that both the platforms on which development can take place, as well as the data that those platforms depend on, will remain proprietary and in the hands of a very small number of players for quite a long period of time. First of all, I'm wondering if you think that's right. Like, is there an eventuality, like, can you paint a path by which that doesn't become the case? Like, we see more of a World Wide Web of AI instead of like a Facebook of AI. And second, if that were to come to pass, does that change the narrative in your mind around, or maybe the balance in your mind around what the implication for jobs could look like in the future and like innovation on top of these platforms?
Let's first distinguish AI technology in the form of algorithms, and you have at least 7 committed, capable, large players there. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, all with extraordinary capability in AI, just in the underlying technology. So this is not trained AI with the data. This is the provision of AI services. At the moment, I'm not seeing a competitive problem in the provision of the AI technology. In addition, a lot of AI technology is available through universities. That is, I'm talking only about the algorithms here, not the data on which those algorithms are trained. So I don't see a looming problem of the tending to monopoly in the underlying technology. In terms of the
sorry, just to interject real quick, Preston. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I just want to distinguish between whether the industry is competitive enough and whether it is a platform that supports open innovation by a wide range of other players. So there's a difference between those two things, right? And like, I think we could argue that, while computing run by Microsoft and Apple and a couple of other small bit players through the 80s, maybe it was somewhat concentrated, the platform it enabled a huge amount of innovation. My own view is that while there's 7 companies that are prominent in this space right now, the platforms they're on don't enable innovation in the same way because the data lakes that they're privy to are so proprietary and walled. So like it's very hard for people to benefit from that.
So that's why I wanted to distinguish the algorithms from the data. I agree that data is very much locked up in a variety of players. One thing, though, is that in fact, and this goes to the privacy issue, that privacy will make that worse. So right now, there are lots of companies, on the order of a dozen, that can provide pretty detailed profiles of most Americans. Just you take your ISPs, the credit card companies, Facebook, Google, Amazon. You've got pretty many players, the Equifax and TransUnion and so on, who actually understand Americans, American households, scarily well. And we sort of saw that with the, so much was lost with the Equifax data spill. So there's a lot of data for understanding what what Americans are doing. Again, it's true that it's locked up, but it's probably the case that if you took any two, you actually could build a profile that covered any third one. So in that sense, there's a lot of data that's stored among different players that would be in principle available, and often in practice. I mean, the ISPs are selling, making tens of billions of dollars selling data on Americans and on what we're doing online and so on. So this, by the way, I'm not saying this is you've raised a question in which this is part of an answer to that question, and yet it creates all of its own concerns in the form of privacy. One of my former employers, Yahoo, had an SVP who went to Congress and said, open is for losers. What he meant was Yahoo had opened up its search because it was falling behind. Well, that's actually something that you do if you're falling behind. But the point is, once you have 7 big players, one of them's going to be falling behind and is likely to then try to use openness as a strategy toward. But let me finish with. But let's bear in mind that this has terrible implications for privacy. Right? Is that the open trained AI provider is actually giving away or selling data to at rock bottom prices, and that's a very scary thing. It's also scary for malware and hackers and so on, because the weak player who has lots of data but just not quite as much now is will choose. It's not rational for them to spend too much money protecting that data. And that's a scary thing as well. And so I don't know where we go. That's why I'm kind of interested to see what happens with GDPR, because I think we do need government intervention to put standards in, because there's too many, there's too many bad implications for me if Target loses control of its data.
Let me ask, so I got a couple of questions from the audience. Yash, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you, Preston. So my question is about AI and market design or marketplace optimization. So AI or ML, the standard approaches don't inherently account for participant incentives, which of course are very important in marketplaces, and they can have short-run incentives as well as long-run incentives. So, I mean, as somebody who works in marketplaces, I don't want my work to be sort of disjointed from AI and all this data that's being collected. So how can these two sort of work in synergy with each other? Can you have AI which accounts for incentive?
It's a fantastic question, and I've been spending a fair bit of time on this exact question. First, let me say I'm a big fan of David Parks and some of his colleagues' work on automated mechanism design. Now, what he's done is say in the Meyerson environment, so this is in the optimal auctions environment, can AI learn the optimal auction? And the answer to that question is approximately yes. Now that has no implications for actual for the practice of market design, because after all, we already knew the answer in that environment. But what he's shown, what they have shown, that I think is very important, is that whether or not you accept that AI took account of the marketplace the incentives of the participants, those incentives were incorporated into the solution. That is to say, it found the solution which is the optimum market design given those incentives and given the behavior of the participants. So I think this is going to be a huge branch of market design, is using tools that essentially play games. So actually, let me connect this thread another way. We've learned that AI can, especially deep neural nets, can play games very effectively. That is, it's good at playing. If you think about DeepMind, for example, DeepMind, that's essentially what it does, is it plays games extremely effectively. And it does that by training and iterating. I actually think we can do this in the real world. That is to say, we can put in place market designs which are approximate and which learn to do better by watching participants, and maybe even by doing controlled experiments where you do, I've got many different counties. I put in place market designs that are slightly different in the different counties. I start seeing how people behave, and I treat that as controlled experiments, and I start to learn, and then iterate and change the incentives. And so actually it's something where when people starting their PhDs ask me what they should be doing, what's a good thing to be doing, this is one of them, is start doing market design with automation. But that's only one thread in the answer. I think that's the biggest thread. But also we're seeing a lot more of, can I use AI to understand how markets work? That is, can I use AI with econometrics? And so a technique I like very much called 2ML or double ML, doubly robust ML. I actually think this is a transformative technique because it allows us to do, and again, I think it's not a complete lock that it will allow us, but it's a technique that in some circumstances at least lets us take data that was clearly not causal and has lots of causality problems and tease out some causality even when we don't fully understand the structure. And that I think can be really important. Let me pause there and see if there's follow-up.
I just have
I don't know if, Vince, do you want to say something?
I just wanted to briefly follow up and point out that I think we've had a fairly narrow interpretation of AI in much of this discussion, and the AI research community is very broad, right? And so there are many people that work on planning and reasoning under uncertainty, right? So many of the algorithms that you see used at Uber might reasonably also appear in the AI community. There's always kind of a difficult question, like what's the boundary of AI? What makes something AI? What makes something not AI? And there's also this, what's known as the AI effect, that once something is really well understood as a little component, it's not really considered AI anymore. And I think like, oh, that's fine. And, we shouldn't spend too much time figuring out like what is exactly what is AI and what is not AI. And I think many of the collaborations and opportunities that Preston is pointing out are exactly in that direction. But I think it is important to many aspects of the conversation we've been having, right? Also in terms of the effect that AI has already had. And not just AI, I think initially we were talking a little bit more broadly about IT, right? As we're talking about taking over jobs or part of jobs, right? Of course, the Ubers and Lyfts of the world, the algorithms are doing a lot of work already. But also there's just stuff like, I can go to a restaurant and order on an iPad. I'm pretty comfortable that that's not AI, right? But that's still a change as well, right? That I think lives in the same general sphere, at least if you think about IT.
Yeah, I think that's fair. In fact, a lot of things so suggestions that the restaurant makes get smarter every year. There are a lot of algorithms that we wouldn't describe as being AI necessarily, but in fact are, as they get smarter, at some point, we tend to say it's AI if it's magical, when really it should be AI if it's machine learning and machine doing things that weren't kind of explicitly programmed in a if this then that way. And so I think that's fair. I do think with the distinction I want to draw from market design is there was market design that was executed with a paper and pencil. And then there's market design where nobody really understands why this market is working. And it's doing things that people that aren't actually programmed by people. By the way, if you're familiar with the way chips are designed, so chips were initially designed, by hand, by somebody drawing the circuits way back in the Gordon Moore day, and somewhere many generations ago, we started using machines to design chips, and then we started using algorithms where the algorithm was designed by another algorithm. So a human designs an algorithm that designs an algorithm that designs a chip. And then that gets higher and higher level until you get to today where really very, well, for one thing, you can get kind of like what seem like boneheaded mistakes because of an algorithmic programming error, where that gets executed many levels down because the chips themselves are designed by artificial intelligence. it's only when we actually build the chip that we say, huh, this didn't really behave the way we had intended. And so I think, there are a lot of applications where the distinction I want to draw is much of market design has been in the paper and pencil. We think about what might work. We run some experimental tests for that with small numbers, with small numbers of college undergrads playing games. And then that's the market design we go with. And there are theorems that are guiding us, as opposed to using machine intelligence, which I think there's going to be a lot more of that in the future.
So
Preston,
I
can I
think
ask
that's
you
a very
sorry, go ahead, Nicole.
interesting kind of observation, because a big push in the AI community these days, and Vince can correct me if I'm wrong, is to think about whether there's a benefit to having AI that's interpretable. And I think that's driven in part by wanting some kind of accountability in the AI communities, and maybe also transferability of what we've learned from one setting to another. But in the market design community, I think there's even yet another aspect here, which you address in your interview, which is that when you're designing markets, you need to be very careful about, people will make mistakes, and you need to know how it's going to respond to the mistakes. And I think if we have completely automated designs, even if it's based on some kind of randomized control trial, you're going to be susceptible to mistakes that you didn't anticipate, and you won't be able to understand how it recovers or how it responds to the mistakes that the participants are making.
Yeah, actually, this is a really important, there's a bunch of different important points that you've made all in a very succinct way. First, errors are a first-class citizen in the market design. And they aren't always, they should be. They should always be a first-class citizen, which is to say, people will make mistakes. If those mistakes are devastating to those people, that's part of the outcome. And that the market created is that it devastated some people, perhaps unnecessarily, or at least compared to, that should be taken into account. In the same way that if you were engineering a consumer device and it occasionally electrocuted people because they did something stupid, that should be part of the engineering design. And the same is true about market design, is that we should build the market design with the understanding that people will push the wrong button, they will choose the wrong thing, they will misunderstand the circumstances they're in, they'll make mistakes. And one of the things that we should be evaluating market designs on are the proportion of mistakes that they make and how bad those mistakes are. And that should be part of the welfare calculus. And just to, when they do these experiments, they often trick the experiment in the following way. If you make a really big difference between the first best and the second best outcome, you'll get the first best way more often, because people will figure out how to get to the first best. On the other hand, if you have a much smaller set, like the first best is only a little better than the second best and a little better than the third best and so on, you'll get a much more realistic picture of what people actually do. And that should be part of the experimental design. So taking into account the errors that people make, I think that's and the mistakes that they make, this should be part of market design and a first-class citizen in the design.
So let me jump quickly into asking Hector Lopez to unmute himself. He has a question. Hector?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you all for opening this space. I am, as I'm pretty sure other people who usually don't have access, very grateful. So having said that, I have a very high level question about implementation of market design or some design. And the way I see it, there are some market design changes that are big, say making a school district go from traditional admissions to deferred acceptance or Gale-Shapley type. And there are some others that are small, say you have a ride-sharing platform and you are deciding the optimal placing of the T button, or if the default should be 10 or 5. So I understand that AI and other techniques could be really, really useful for those final refinements, but maybe not as useful for the big changes. And you start describing the paper and pencil approach. But if you go and if you need to convince a government official or even within a company that doing one of those big discrete changes is good or better, how do you go about it? In many places there is a lot of resistance. So what should be the market design playbook to start having a really good top of the line implementation plan to go from status quo to a better market?
So that's a really great question. And I don't know that I've got a complete answer to it, but one of the things that I think has proved effective in the past is actually getting decision makers to participate in experiments. Now, these have to be carefully designed experiments, but for example, with the PCS auctions, we had them bid in little auctions so that they could see, and we would sometimes do the auction that we were proposing versus some other auctions that others were proposing, and let them just see what the experience for themselves, what problems arose, and what the problems we were trying to solve were. Now, this is always a challenge because you don't get them, you can't say, we're going to spend 8 hours explaining the environment to you. No, you have to actually craft little experiments that they can participate in 45 minutes or an hour and experience for themselves what will go wrong if some other proposals are adopted, and experience that those things won't go wrong, that they will be in the position that they're glad to have the design that's been proposed, that design does a good job of balancing many different needs. So that's one thread, is how do you educate the people who actually own the decisions? The second thing is there are always intense efforts to lobby to capture the process to the benefit of a small number of parties. And I'm going to give an example from Mexico. So I helped design auctions in Mexico for Spectrum. And unfortunately, I wish I spoke Spanish, but I have very little Spanish ability in Spanish, and that's pretty much how to get ice in my drink in restaurants. And we had the question of what is a standing high bidder, and a group that was trying to distort the auctions used a term that would have just completely changed the meaning of the auction for the phrase standing high bidder, meaning someone who's a tentative winner but isn't actually being assigned something, that this would have allowed them to be assigned actual properties. And in the end, we had to deal with these and also we had lobbying efforts from Telmex, which very important player, and we came up with a compromise with Telmex that Telmex was willing to accept. But let me say, there were people who said Telmex already has too much spectrum, they should be denied. We would then, and we were worried about Telmex actually managing to destroy the whole thing if we didn't actually find a decent compromise with them. So I think the politics, they're always intense, and there's always a balancing on the politics. And that's not something, I think that's a really serious problem, especially when you're talking about large changes versus incremental changes.
So one thing I might add is that sometimes there's a huge disruption which forces a large change, and something we're experiencing right now is all of this, like everything is virtual. And I thought maybe you could have some closing remarks on the virtual and remote work and virtual seminars and all of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I'm hopeful that we're going to see lasting benefits from this movement online. And one of those, so my forecast is, and there's less data behind this than I would like, is that that business travel will recover to a level that's less than half of its 2019 peak. And that's because we've learned that we can actually do a lot more virtually. I actually expect that I will rarely, if ever, physically go to a conference again, because conferences can work great virtually. Now there's some issues on how you pull that off, how you substitute, how you meet new people. But I think all those issues have resolutions, and it's, we spend so much time in travel that it's going to return a lot of benefits. I'm a little less optimistic about work from home, but that is to say that work from home, so the good side is you're seeing a lot of firms say, we're actually getting more lines of code out of our engineers than we were getting pre-COVID when they work from home. And so that looks like an increase in productivity. And let me harken back to my earlier comment that, when what you really want is good code. If what you can measure is lines of code, you actually get, and you reward on the basis of lines of code, you actually get bad code, just as an example. But I think we're going to see lasting changes in the way that we do business, that in a way that will actually be more productive for us. At least I'm hopeful of that, both in business travel and in greater work from home in circumstances where that works. The real problem is if you live in New York and you've got a postage stamp of an apartment, work from home can be quite unpleasant and difficult. And if we're still that you've got 3 other family members in that New York apartment, work from home can be almost impossible. And people
then we can all move to sunny Pasadena.
Yes, I mean, except that so actually, all right, this is a good thing to end on. Cities are way more productive than non-cities, and I mean way more productive. They produce something like 50% more output with 30% fewer inputs, 30% less energy. We don't know why cities are so productive, but they really are. If you look at the United States, the cities are dramatically more productive. In China, that difference is even larger, although and China is actually looking at how do we put 100 million people in the same city. They're actually thinking seriously about how we make cities even bigger than they've ever been, because cities are so much more productive. And again, not just in terms of its economic output per worker, but also in conserving inputs, in energy use, in transportation, and all of that. And so we're, humanity at 8 billion people is kind of screwed if we can't make cities work. And so that's one of the really big downsides of COVID is that insofar as it pushes us back into our cars, into using plastic bags, into avoiding cities, it could actually make a sustainability gets more remote. Economists are famous for raining on other people's parades, and so that's probably a good place to say that we've run out of our hour.
So yeah, I just wanted to thank you so much, Preston, and to just thank the guests again, Nicole, Vince, and Ramesh for a delightful chat, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks, Preston, and thanks Danielle and Yash for putting this together, and looking forward to the upcoming seminars.
Also Gagan and Judy, there's 4 of us.
Yeah, thank you everyone. This is a great discussion. It's all recorded and put it online as well for people to watch it later on.
Yeah, and if some people want to stay and chat,